And thank you, Dr. Farouk. It's always a great pleasure to be here, and thank you for inviting me again. I've always been a great admirer of Farouk's work, and so it's a great pleasure to be sitting next to him. And I'm very delighted to be able to speak to this subject. He's given me a very, very difficult task, however. There is no clear answer, as I'm sure you're all aware, of this question of Islam and secularism and the relationship between Islam and the secular state. What I would like to try to do is to try to bring together some of the larger thinking in the Muslim world on this subject, some of the debates that have occurred about secularism, and then to apply it to this increasing, as Farouk says, this increasing demand that we hear in many circles, not just in Malaysia, for an Islamic state. What does it represent? What are the possibilities? What are the problems attached to the idea of a religious state? So let me start by saying that, this is a topic which at least superficially would seem to be a settled one from the Muslim perspective. What could be controversial about it from the Muslim perspective? Clearly, they would need to be incompatible. This is generally a view which is held by many, many Muslim thinkers, and there have been many Muslims who would argue very strongly that not only is secularism sort of an alien idea, but it's predicated on atheism, and therefore is inevitably irreligious. Of course, one of the debates is, should one collapse secularism with atheism? But some do. Many would say that it therefore is incompatible with the comprehensiveness of Islam. And I've cited here two of the Saudi ulama. And the reason why I choose them, I think you probably instinctively would say, well, of course the Saudis are going to say that secularism is un-Islamic. But the reason I choose these two members of the ulama is that they have quite a reputation in the West for being liberal, for being those who have been who have been criticizing the regime for its policies in various forms. So they instinctively are presented as representatives of what might be considered a liberal Wahhabism, if there is such a thing. And so Salman Auda and Safar Hawali, but they have written quite clearly that secularism is unacceptable, following the general line, that it is tantamount to Jahiliyyah. I'm sure most of you are aware, this is the term for the pre-Islamic period. Therefore, it's a powerfully delegitimizing concept. To render unto God that which is God's, to render unto Caesar that which is to Caesar, is to take away from the sovereignty of God, and that therefore is unacceptable, haram. And a person who in particular would be criticized by them is exactly the person that Farouk mentioned in his early comments. This is Ali Abdul Razik, and an alim, a religious official at Al-Azhar, otherwise considered one of the central Muslim institutions of education. In his very famous book, Al-Islam wal-Usul al-Hukm, very clearly sort of argues that there should be a separation of the religious and a separation from the political, etc. And as Farouk says, stripped of his ability to teach as a result of that, highly controversial since then. And he is certainly quoted and cited by many, many conservative Muslims as the sort of the archenemy. This is a member of the religious establishment who sold out to the kind of Western view of all this and accepted that secularism is acceptable. you know, and I quote here from, I think it is Hawali, who said in one of his writings that it just doesn't make sense that we tell Muslims that they should say their prayers at the mosque, and then that when they leave the mosque, they should leave religion there. And his argument is, and their argument is, well, that doesn't make sense. That they should carry it on into the larger society. And there's something to that argument. And what I'm going to try to argue is state is one thing, society is another. And that will be the general gist of my argument, the general thrust of it. So we have a clear conservative opinion, and many would say the dominant one, that there is an incompatibility between Islam and secularism. Now, having said that, I should point out that, of course, there are those who argue that there is a form of compatibility between Islam and secularism. This is a kind of a rich intellectual tradition that probably can be dated to the 19th and 20th centuries. Albert Harani, who was one of my great teachers at Oxford, said that he called this the liberal age. And this is, you know, it's the period which I think many observers of Islam would say is gone. The great liberal age of Muslim thinking is probably past. But here the great age then was the figure Muhammad Abdu, Afghani, Al-Kawakabi, Tatawi, these great figures of the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, would have been influenced, of course, by the close contact with Westerners, and as a result, ideas such as constitutionalism, ideas such as citizenship, ideas such as freedom, etc., one would wonder where are the Islamic roots of these, and each of these thinkers try to respond to that and to try to argue that many of these ideas were inherent in Islam. And so that kind of liberal argument gained currency in certain circles and was a powerful one. And in many ways, some continue that tradition today, others find it buried. If skipping to a now much more recent period, we have someone such as Abdullahi Naim, who many of you may know of, professor of law, who has argued quite clearly that not only are they compatible, Islam and secularism, but they're absolutely essential, that Muslims must have secularism in order to be a Muslim, in order to be able to do what they want to do. The state, in a way, must remain secular in order for religion to sort of flourish. So you can immediately see that this argument is a very powerful one, but one which is heavily, heavily criticized by many thinkers. There are even more controversial writers, such as Hirsi Ali, again, some of you will know who this is, Magdi Alam, Amir Tahiri, Ibn Waraq. All of these argue for that Muslims ought to be inherently secular. And I quote here the St. Petersburg Declaration of 2007, which these Muslim intellectuals signed, which said, "We are secular Muslims and secular persons of Muslim societies. We are believers, doubters, and unbelievers, brought together by a great struggle, not between the West and Islam, but between the free and the unfree. We say to Muslim believers, there is a noble future for Islam as a personal faith, but not a political doctrine." And I guess you could summarize the views of this school of thought as, for there to be belief, there must be unbelief. And that, of course, can be considered a very controversial statement in some circles. Yeah. So we come to this question about the nature of secularism. And I think it's safe to say that what we could say here is that it's an essentially contested term in the way that we use this in a kind of philosophical debates about various terms. Democracy is an essentially contested term. Freedom is an essentially contested term. That is to say that we have a rough idea of what we mean by it, but we are not able to be specific in articulating its exact conditions. And certainly we must accept that it varies in application from society to society. So in that sense, secularism is an essentially contested term. Well, we know that the English word comes from the Latin saeculum, which means this worldly as opposed to otherworldly. The other term which is often used is laïcité, which is, of course, the term that characterizes the French debate on this subject. Laïcité originally referred to the non-clergy, the people who are lay persons, etc. But of course it became over time to be identified with a rigid separation of the religious from the political. And many will cite the French example as the sort of the arch example of secularism today, you know, a very rigid distinction between the religious and the political establishments, with, of course, you know, the whole debate over the hijab, the niqab, etc. Just to anticipate a point that will come up in discussion, I'm sure, is that, you know, we blame the French, you know, until very recently there was this kind of Anglo-Saxon sort of almost pride that the Anglo-Saxon world was so different from the Francophonic world. They were intolerant. The Anglo-Saxon world was going to be much more tolerant towards the niqab and the hijab, etc. Well, I'm here to tell you that the debate has shifted very, very considerably across Europe, and it has shifted very considerably against the idea that these should be allowed in free societies. So the whole debate has shifted, if you will, to the right. And the kind of French view is now increasingly being accepted. Austria has just done this. Germany is doing it. The Scandinavian countries are doing it. It's being debated at the local level in the UK. So things have moved. So what we have, of course, is a variety of social theories. We have, you know, it's this worldly, it's the separation, etc. What is secularism? And I guess the simple answer here is that social scientists don't really agree, and that there are different views of what we mean by secularism. And you could stretch it out and extrapolate maybe 5, 6 different views of it. But let me just summarize it into kind of 2 views. There's the kind of the American view and the kind of Turkish model. Okay, the American model is meant to be the separation of church and state, that they should be very different. They should be separated. The Turkish, and Bernard Lewis quite rightly points to this and says it's not just the Turkish, it's the Byzantine model. The Byzantine model is not so much that there is a separation of church and state, but state controls the church. State controls the religion. So we have 2 different versions, 2 different major models of secularism. You separate them, or the church is dominated by the state. So it's quite interesting how we have, sometimes when we use this terminology, we have to be aware of the fact that it's being used in different ways. An aside for a second, this little depiction that I've got, this graphic there, I think is actually telling in some ways, because the reality is that what I just said to you are paradigmatic differences, pure models. In practice, it doesn't work that way. In practice, as this sort of suggests, the puzzle is connected. That in America, the pious fiction of the American Constitution is that there is a separation of church and state. The reality is that they're intermixed all the time, and that they're constantly interacting. So at least we have two pure models. In practice, we don't really have this being carried out all the time. So I guess we could summarize the ideals in sort of two ways. What is considered sort of ideal? State hands should stay off religion, and religious hands should stay off the state. So we have a choice of how we want to approach this. And you can see that the debate is quite a considerable one. I think what is missing in most of the discussions, I've just outlined sort of, models, approaches. What I think is missing here is to place it in the historical and cultural context. Secularism is culturally and historically contingent. Secular society that we've been talking about, historically and culturally rooted. It's rooted, of course, in the European experience. What's the European experience? Roughly from the 16th century, the political power shifted from the state to the evolving, burgeoning, developing, from the church to the burgeoning state institution. So we have the period of European state formation. As the European state formation is occurring, the power of the church is waning and the power of the state is increasing. Now, this is aided, abetted by the advent of Protestantism, by the Reformation, if you will, that approved of the separation between the church and the state. Why? Because this would guarantee the incorruptibility of religion. Religion had become corrupt in the old approach, etc. The joining of the church and the state in the Catholic era had been a recipe for both religious and political corruption. Bringing them together was wrong. Separate them would in fact allow for the necessary reform. The great sociologist Weber noted the essential irony of this process, that the profound push for secularism in Europe came from a religious source, came from the Protestant Reformation, which is essentially argued that salvation depended on what occurs in this world, that the otherworldly had been controlled by this corrupt church in league with corrupt imperial or state authorities. Therefore, the need to separate them leads to the view that salvation occurs in this world. And of course, in the very famous Weberian formulation of this history, not only was it necessary to have this salvation was this worldly, it was the major impetus to capitalism. Success would be measured by your economic success, etc. So capitalism is being pushed in a kind of ironically through a religious, secular way, bringing them together. So we have Islamic history. The trajectory is very different outside of Europe, of course. We have, hi, Dr. Zul. I have to watch what I say now.
No, that's big. Oh. Is that a compliment?
He's a good old friend. So I'm sure you'll cut me some slack here, I know. The trajectory is different in the Islamic world. Okay, so and I want to come back to this larger view about what the Islamic ideal is, but essentially speaking, and this is a view of Islamic history which may not be shared by everyone, that ecclesiastical authorities did have a role. The church, the ulama, the religious authorities do have a role to play. The guidance, they're the guardians of the law. They are to advise, if you ask any of the major ulama now what is their role to play, they would say nasiha, advice. We should be giving advice to the rulers, to the princes. And that's a venerable Islamic tradition. But despite what many will assume, and I'll come back to this, despite what many assume, does this mean that there is a fusion of religion and state? This I doubt. My interpretation of Islamic history is that the religious and the political, in effect, were divided or separated over time. And you can see that there's a debate among the historians. Most people would argue, or I should rephrase that, not most people, some people would argue that there has been this separation in Islamic history between the religious institution and the political institution. The question, I say that, the question then is, when did it occur? And some people say it's very modern. Some people would say it occurred in the 11th century when the Seljuks were in effect controlling the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad. Some would say it was even earlier in the 10th century because of the Buwayhids. Others will say it was in the 9th century with the formation of the schools of law. And Ibn Khaldun, who will be known to all of you, Ibn Khaldun says it goes back to the Khulafa Rashidun. It goes back to the rightly guided caliphs. That there is a separation right after the Prophet between the political establishment and the religious establishment. This is when mulk came in. This is when kingship came in, rather than religiously endowed sort of forms of governance. So there is a view of history to which I generally subscribe that would say the fusion of religion and the state can be questioned, even as a historic fact. So we have trends. Here, this I'm sure is quite contentious, but here's roughly what I mean. The experience of the history that I just told you about, I think in many ways, strangely, weirdly, comes close to the Protestant ideal. Not the Islamic ideal, but the Islamic experience comes roughly to the Protestant ideal. A secularizing religion. A religion which has a place, values, norms, etc., which have a place, but don't necessarily govern in terms of control of a state. So I throw that out there, and that I'm sure that will be it's a contentious point. So what do I think has been happening? Well, first big trend, secularization has long been underway. So whether we like it or we don't like it, secularization has long been occurring. I invoke Nurholis Majid, who many of you will know from this part of the world, an Indonesian academic who long ago advocated the idea of Islamic secularization. He talked about desacralization of certain activities of life. I would just put it more neutrally. I would say that the conditions of modernity, the impact of modern education has led to a kind of differentiation, individualization, the valuing of the pragmatic, rationalist logic, all of these things that we just accept as a part of everyday life, that we would say that those things have been accepted as a way of living rather than simply deference to divine ordinance. You know, Gramsci said, he had a nice phrase, Gramsci said, the unity of faith between a conception of the world and a corresponding norm of conduct has been sort of questioned. This idea that we have a divinely inspired, all-encompassing worldview. We do A because God told us to do it. We do B because God told us to do it. We tell C because God told us to do it. That's very different from saying, I do A because I'm going to profit from it. Things work better as a result of that. It's a pragmatic rationalist logic rather than one which is deduced from some sort of divine ordinance. So the first is that secularization has been going on for some time. The second is, and this is sometimes missed in the argument, that even though secularization has been going on for some time, it doesn't mean there's a diminution of religious belief. Quite to the contrary, quite to the contrary. Again, I quote Weber. Now, Weber put it in a kind of a negative way. He said, secular society is haunted by the ghosts of religious belief. I mean, it's a wonderful phrase, but it's a terribly biased phrase. Haunted by these ghosts. But you get the point that religion doesn't disappear. And one of the ironies of history is the French Revolution, made in the name of rationalism and liberalism, leads to an increase in religiosity. We have all kinds of historical evidence that the aftermath of the French Revolution, we have a rise in religious sentiment in France as a result of this. So, in the pre-industrial age, in the industrial age, religion doesn't disappear, it becomes really more important. And of course, what completely is wrong, what is just completely misguided, is modernization theory, which argued as we move towards modernity, as we move towards a modernized society, then religion is going to be circumscribed to, if anything, to the private realm, and it will have no importance in society, no importance in public life. There's the very famous Harvard sociologist Daniel Lerner said, I can summarize for you the future. The future is Mecca or mechanization. It's a great phrase. How wrong could you be? How wrong could you be? It's not or, it's and. And so we can see a whole, assumption in the literature, assumption by theorists which was just completely wrong. So secularization doesn't lead to the diminution of belief. So my third trend is that the line between what is religious and secular is largely set by the political process. So here we have a point which I want you to remember when we come to my final comments about the state. And that, how do we understand what was going on in Turkey? Turkey is supposed to be the secular state, etc. Well, we can debate that, and we can debate what it meant by secular, etc. But there's no question that a kind of Islam-leaning party has been in control for some time. And the only way we can understand that is looking at the political process of Turkey and the different parties, the different viewpoints, etc. Islam, in other words, becomes part of the contestation, political contestation of any societies. So I guess my point that I really want to get across here is that religion is not excluded as a political actor representing societal demands. Representing societal demands. But it becomes problematic, of course, when this raison d'etat becomes equivalent to God's will. When they're completely collapsed, when you make a confluence of the two, then I think maybe you're starting to get into some trouble. And of course, here we get into the much more contentious area. This, of course, now brings us into the idea of the current debates that are going on about the Sharia. And, as I said earlier, this is across all Muslim societies. Look at the UK. there's a debate in the UK about the place of it, not only among Muslims, but also, very famously, I think many of you know, the former Archbishop of Canterbury actually said, what's wrong with it? Let's incorporate the Sharia into the civil law of the UK. So we have all kinds of lively debates going on about the place of the Sharia. And I mention this, of course, because this becomes one of this is kind of the litmus test, the lightning rod for this big discussion about the nature, the power of an Islamic state, a secular state. But just to note that there are different ways of approaching it, even within the kind of Muslim world. Do you limit the Sharia to laws of personal status? Morocco, Egypt. Do you proclaim it as the law of the land? Saudi Arabia, Iran, the Taliban, ISIS. Do you do that? I did note that the Iranian case is awkward because the regime says it's the law of the land, but it also says that the government edicts can supersede Sharia edicts because they are ipso facto, by definition, primary injunctions of Islam. The Islamic government is Islamic, therefore the Islamic government cannot tell you an un-Islamic thing. So we have a kind of circularity of logic in the case of Iran, which some have questioned. And then finally, do we implement it as parts of the general civil law, as part of the criminal or public law? You don't need me to tell you that this has local relevance. So there we go. So this is all part of the whole idea of the Islamic State. Now, here I want to say, and here again, this is perhaps a controversial interpretation. So I'm going to lay my cards on the table very clearly. The Islamic State is an invented tradition. It is a modern contrivance. It probably dates to the late colonial period. Certainly it's a post-colonial development in many ways. Farouk said quite rightly, 1924 becomes an important event. The abolition of the caliphate is shocking, at least in the Sunni world, but there are clear parallels in the Shiite world as well. What do we replace the caliphate with? Well, we replace it with something called, Rashid Rida called it al-Hukuma al-Islamiyya, or others call it the Dawla Islamiyya. So Islamic government or Islamic state, but something should replace the caliphate. But what does it mean? Little agreement on what it means and what it constitutes. Some people invert, many will know that the great theorist of the caliphate is Mawardi, exactly, the Ahkam al-Sultaniyya, and who basically said that the prophecy, the caliphate is that institution which replaces prophecy, replaces the prophecy of the Prophet Muhammad. And in the same sort of way, the Islamic State becomes that which, the law becomes that which replaces the caliphate. So places the law at the center of the Sharia. That's why the debates of the Sharia are so important. But how much? What version of the Sharia? So this view of inventing the tradition, I think, has three implicit assumptions built into it. The first assumption, in other words, we need an Islamic state. What is this built on? First, din wa dawla. Okay? Din wa dawla, religion and state, they must be together, they must be combined. So saying it more strongly than I should, an invented tradition. Who says that there should be religion and state one and the same? So that's built into it. Secondly, the state must be obeyed because it's Islamic authority. So similar to what I said about Iran. Third, the state becomes the guarantor of morality. And of course, this is the whole debate about hispa. And we know that there's more to be said about that. But so I think these are embedded in the idea that we need an Islamic state, that religion demands a state, that you must obey that state, and that state will be the major guarantor of morality. Now, and I know this will upset some people by even mentioning it, but just to show you that my point here is largely that there are great debates and no consensus on all of these things. When we look at this extreme interpretation of ISIS, we have exactly the same thing going on. So the caliphate is supposed to be the Islamic State, and look at the debates that have emerged already. And good for the Muslim world that it is having this vigorous debate over this particular kind of distortion in my mind of Islamic political thought. But there's the debate. So you want a caliphate? Is it now or is it gradual? Is it by proclamation, as they did, or is it by consensus of the community? Is it an end in itself, or is it a means to power? And I mean, to show that there is no agreement even within the world of militancy, Al-Qaeda has criticized ISIS for having the wrong interpretation of the caliphate. So I think you get some idea of the contentiousness of this debate. So I'm kind of moving towards my big point now at the end by talking about the religious versus the secular state. So I asked 3 questions. Is state the same as society? No. Simple answer. But I think that this is not understood in a lot of the debates. So as we have seen, secularization has proceeded, but so has religious sentiment. So within society, we have religiosity, we have social organizations, we have groupings, we have political organizations which are representative of that belief within the society. That's good. That's the way it should be. That's the great debate that all societies should have. You've got beliefs, you should be able to express those beliefs. You should be able to also listen to other people's beliefs as well. And so let society take the heavy, let it do the heavy lifting here, not the state, as it were. So we must remember this distinction between the state and the society. Second question I ask is, can the secular state be neutral, as the theory would suggest? Okay, so all the theories of secularism say the state must be neutral. The state must be neutral here. Now, is this possible? I think it's very difficult. I think it's very difficult for the state to be neutral. And so I concede this point, and I think this is something to think about. It is hard. I at least would hold out the distinction between what I would call political secularism and social secularism. Political secularism would say we're all citizens. Citizens is the primary identifier here. That's what matters when we're talking about the state. But social secularism also occurs. And we should, as a result of that, know that yes, it is true that there has been some secularization, but it's also true that it's not destined to diminish. So the state may not ultimately be able to be neutral, but it should put the primary emphasis on this political secularism or citizenship. And then, is a religious state illiberal? Well, and I want to be absolutely clear here that Islam is not the problem. The problem is not religion per se. religious norms, Islamic norms can be interpreted either way. Dr. Zul knows, we've endlessly talked about the relationship between Islam and democracy. To my mind, there is absolutely nothing in Islam which precludes the development of democracy. Nothing. Islamist groups can therefore be agents of democratization. I have no problem with that. The difficulty becomes when the state appropriates the right to speak on behalf of what is ordainedly, divined ordainedly, or to put it differently, in the French Revolution way, to speak on behalf of virtue. So what are the problems? The religious state runs the risk of assuming that the state can impose on society because state and society are the same. But I've argued they're not. It runs the risk of blurring the line between public and private morality. It is our obligation to enforce morality, hispa. But where do we draw the line? Who has to follow this? Shouldn't the private be private? If we guarantee public virtue, are we intruding on the private sphere? Well, often this happens. And so as a result of that, that's a problem. Relying on the virtue of rulers rather than institutional or structural safeguards. You often hear, okay, it's not so much a religious state, it's the ruling regime, it's the regime that's religious, and they're good guys. Well, it's a gamble. It's something that you have to, I'm not so sure I want to put my money on that. And I'm sure you can think of examples in the Arabian Peninsula which might make my point. And reinforcing unjust authority because it claims to represent divine will. So in other words, these are kind of inherent problems. So I come to the balance of probabilities. This, of course, does not mean that political authorities in a religious state are inevitably tyrannical. It doesn't mean that. It doesn't mean that there's an automatic relationship between that and tyranny. Less so does it mean that secular states are wonderful and free of all problems. Stalinist Russia. You would not want to live under Stalinist Russia. But the balance of probabilities is that a religious state comes down to political elites who use religion for political purposes. In doing so, particularistic interests trump the pluralistic interests of society, and the common good evaporates. And so the final word. As the Christian Reformation argued, when the state thinks it's doing God's work, it runs the risk of betraying both its people and God. And so I think the final word should go to Charles Taylor, and I think I can summarize his views in this way. Secularism is not having to encounter God in the public sphere unless I want to. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof, for a very interesting talk. And I guess it's very important when you pointed out that this concept of Islamic State is basically a modern construct. Because I guess, like many of the Islamists and many of the people basically here in this country believe that it was something imperative in the Quran that like we have to establish this Islamic State.
Yeah.
And we have argued about this particular issue because the concept of Dawla Islamiyah was never mentioned. Even the word Dawla was never mentioned in the Quran.
Exactly.
It is an alien word in the Quran. The word Dawla you cannot find in the Quran at all. So it goes. I mean, we can argue about that, Dr. Zul. Yeah. After this, but well, what I'm saying is that it's very important that when you pointed out this particular view that this was the creation after the fall of the Caliphate, of the Osmani Caliphate in the 1924, and I guess it's very important because more and more Muslim scholars are coming out, like Abdullah Naim, and a scholar who wrote from a Sudanese scholar who wrote Who Needs an Islamic State?
Yeah.
What was
Yeah,
no.
The Sudanese guy.
Yeah,
Yeah,
a
yeah.
Sudanese scholar. So and no, I think someone else. No.
Sudanese scholar, remember?
Yeah, Sudanese scholar. Yeah. Pardon? No, student of Turabi, a friend of Turabi. Yeah, student of Turabi.
He was around here, I think.
Yeah, he came over to Malaysia. Yeah, some time ago. But the important thing is that these are the issues that we must be able to debate, and to simplify it to become something which must be accepted. That it is imperative for us to establish God's law and to establish an Islamic state I think is unjust to a plural society like us. And I think it's very important for us to talk about this issue and to discuss and have a proper discourse on this particular topic. And I think I missed that particular name.
Abdul Wahab Al-Effendi.
Yeah, Abdul Wahab Effendi. Yes, Abdul Wahab Effendi. Yeah. And Abdul Wahab Effendi. Yeah, it's very good. Yeah. And